I wanted my decks to be, well, more efficient. I added some awesome spells, but it didn't really get any better. Experienced players told me about the mana base and how important it is, but back then I just didn't listen. Maybe you've heard the joke that the slowest speed is the speed of sound? The things people tell you when you're 15 only start to make sense when you turn 30. Well, by that analogy, it wasn't funny to me, so I decided I needed to figure out the mana base and really understand how lands work in Magic. To make things a bit easier for you now, if you're new to Magic, the Gathering, and just starting out in Commander, I'll walk you through some examples of the mana bases I built over this time. The examples will cover different decks. You can find links to these decks in the description. In this video, I'll be talking specifically about lands. We'll discuss mana rocks and ramp in the next video, so make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and don't miss it. Alright, let's dive into the world of lands and Magic, the Gathering. I have lands in different languages, but I'll explain what they do in case anything isn't clear to you. But some of the lands you'll probably recognize. Let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts. We're heading into the world of mono bases. Just so you understand right away, here we have cEDH, here's a mono red deck, and here's the third bracket, a very strong tempo deck that works with the graveyard. Over here, we have budget decks where we use a lightly modified mono base and allow ourselves to play some lands that I would never use in these other decks. Here it is exactly the same. Here, too, you really don't want to play them, because that would just slow you down. So, let's start with cEDH. Here, we want to see the most efficient mono base possible. We always want to have untapped lands so we can feel great at any moment. I play fetch lands, which in some cases let me find either a basic, a shock land, or a dual land. They look like this. They don't produce mana on their own, but for 1 life, we can search our library. With these lands, we can use them to find 3 shock lands in our library. As you can tell, this is a 3-color deck. The 3 duals are proxies, as you can see. In my region, cEDH is played with full proxies. That's why we have these kinds of proxies. The deck also includes basic lands. My main colors are white and blue. Accordingly, there won't be a black basic land in the deck. So, these 3 lands can fetch us any color combination we need. This way, we stabilize ourselves from the very first turns. If needed, there's also a small number of utility lands included. This is a really good cycle, and I recommend using it. You can even confidently try putting these lands into cEDH decks. If you stabilize skillfully, you'll get your main color and the additional ones you need. Unlike many cEDH pilots, I don't play a large number of fetch lands because I'm wary of opposition agent and don't want to fall victim to it. So I'm willing to pay a little extra. Actually, I'm even fine with paying with my own life points, just to avoid that agent who would steal my land, look at my hand, and figure out my plans. Let's move on. I use pain lands specifically to avoid getting caught by the agent. Pain lands are also very accessible. You can and should find them for your mana base, in my opinion, because they serve 2 purposes. Some decks specifically require colorless mana, and this land provides that colorless mana. Also, for a bit of pain, for 1 damage to yourself, you can get a little bit of the color you need. So, in most cases, this land will just give you colorless mana and won't hurt you. In fewer cases, you'll get the color you need at the right moment. There's also a cycling ability here. I believe that, overall, these lands are a must-have for anyone who plays Commander. These are the lands that content creators often mention when they ask, "Are you ready to give up right now?" And of course, they play a land that specifically asks if you have 2 or more opponents. If yes, then it enters untapped. In terms of functionality in Commander, compared to Underground Sea or Morphic Pool, there's absolutely no difference. Both enter untapped, both produce mana. The only thing is that Morphic Pool can't be fetched with a fetch land. But overall, their functionality is the same. These are very good lands in the Commander format. In 99% of cases, they come out trampled. And of course, we also have Command Tower. It's the best land, unless you're playing monocolor, but that's because in monocolor you only have one color, so why would you need a land with a different name? Well, okay, obviously, there is a reason. If you want to play Field of the Dead, you need lands with different names. And maybe, even in monocolor, you somehow manage to play Field of the Dead. The whole idea of Field of the Dead doesn't really appeal to me, so I only play it in one of my decks, and it's not included here. So, Command Tower. In 3-color decks, Exotic Orchard also performs really well. Exotic Orchard gives you mana of any color that a land under an opponent's control could produce. In tables where you always have tricolors, it is quite possible that an exotic garden will also be found in the table opposite, and then their exotic garden will give mana to your commander's tower. You'll get the mana that their exotic orchard produces. Basically, that's all your colors. Demon's Confluence. Mana Confluence. Pay 1 life to get any color. This is a land that gives you any color. And next to it is City of Brass. I have it in this 6th edition version. When you tap it, it deals damage to you, but gives you any mana. If you can somehow solve the problem of lands hurting you or you not taking damage, then it's basically free. Also, another conditionally multicolored land is Gemstone Caverns. If you have them in your opening hand, they can come into play before the game starts and get a luck counter by exiling a card from your hand. When that happens, this land starts producing any color. A funny rules interaction. If you have an exotic orchard, your opponent has a Gemstone Caverns, and there's no counter on it, then that land doesn't produce any color, even though the option exists. Another interesting thing about Exotic Orchard, if it happens to see a land, let me give you an example, that can produce any color, then Exotic Orchard will also produce all colors. So with Exotic Orchard and Gemstone Caverns, in that case, make sure to check if there's a counter on it. If there is a counter, then Exotic Orchard will give you all the colors you need. I also play a number of specific lands from Avaro. A fantastic land that can serve as an answer or as a bonus for something of yours. It can return an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to your hand. Its cost is reduced for each legendary creature you control. And basically, it's an ability you can activate from your hand, and it's pretty hard to counter. Of course, in cEDH we play Ancient Tomb. It's ramp, it's a game changer. Some of my decks used to have Ancient Tomb, but I decided to take it out. Basically, right now, in my 4th and 5th bracket decks, I do have Ancient Tomb. It's a very powerful land that hurts you by dealing 2 damage, but gives you 2 mana. Urza's Saga. It's a tutor. It's a tutor for an artifact that costs 0 or 1. It also lets you create blockers by tapping it for 2. And it's a very good utility land, especially in decks where you have a lot of 1-mana artifacts that you use. Besides Soul Ring, well, in cEDH for example, it can be 0-mana artifacts like Mana Vault, Crone Mox, or even Mox Diamond if you really need a specific color right now. But in casual decks, Urza's Saga lets you find, besides Soul Ring, things like Sensei's Divining Top and Skull Clamp, for example. You might have other utility 1-mana artifacts that you want to have on the board. In one of my decks, for instance, Urza's Saga is there specifically to find Ethereal. And that's already specific to the deck itself. Phyrexian Altar is a great card for any aristocrat's deck. Sacrifice a creature, get 2 mana. You'll most likely have creatures. So you've seen this kind of base. Just take this, put it in a 3-color deck, and everything will work for you. It'll work. Yes, the number of basic lands will probably be higher in a casual deck. There are 28 lands here. That's it. But this will work. Now let's take a look at another 3-color deck that's a bit more focused on a certain tempo and wants to perform specific actions. I should say that within this mana base, it's not complete. I only pulled out the specific cards that are used. In this deck, I use fetch lands and shock lands. I don't use true duels here, but pretty much everything else you've seen is included. I also don't use Ancient Tomb, City of Brass, or Mana Confluence. So, I'm able to stabilize my mana here in such a way that I don't need to include those kinds of lands. But some people might say they're not unnecessary. That's your choice. I just tried to see different cards in my decks, so I don't try to cram everything in everywhere. What do you notice here first of all? There's another fetch land here, Prismatic Vista. This land specifically searches for a basic land and puts it onto the battlefield. Why? This is a mana base, a piece of the Grixis mana base from the Sauron, Lord of the Rings Commander deck. By turn 4 or 5, I want to take out all my opponents with combat damage, so tempo is really important to me. That's why, at the start, right in the first few turns, lands might come in tapped, but they need to serve a specific purpose. But at a certain point, I need untapped lands. And specifically, I need a mountain. I need mountain to give my creatures haste because I play a creature like Anger. So this mana base is built and tuned in such a way that Anger is always effective, and Wonder too. Accordingly, I want to see Iceland and Mountain in my desk. What you see now is a part of a cycle. The Survail lands are excellent lands. They're extremely efficient. First of all, they have land types, so you can fetch them with fetch lands and shocks. Instead of shocks on the early turns, or when you don't need the mana, they do something specific. They have a trigger. Look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. I can play it on, and usually go for the red-black one, so I have a mountain here, and then on the next turn I can cast Reanimate. Oh, and specifically, for example, you can put Villis from the top of your deck into the graveyard, then reanimate him and draw 8 cards on turn 2. These are pretty powerful plays, and Surveil triggers are very important in some decks, especially in Reanimator. That's why in Reanimator, I might even run cards like these that produce colorless mana and enter untapped, but also have a Surveil trigger. You can't fetch them, since they're just mana, but they prove to be extremely effective. But that's exactly the kind of deck-specific nuance I'm talking about. Since I have a lot of important, cool, and powerful creatures, I don't want anyone else to get their hands on them. That's why we also include Cavern of Souls here, a colorless land that lets you regain control of all your creatures as their owner. And for some spells, like Living Death, I want them to be uncounterable. I want to be able to sacrifice my own creature and maybe even reanimate it again. Eat your creature at the expense of the upper market, sacrificing the creature to gain 1 life. And if needed, having removal for lands and Mount Doom is a must to deal some damage, in my opinion. That's it. I have some legendary artifacts. I used to have a few more, and this land was used more often for board wipes. Now it remains more as a tribute. Pay 1 life, get a black or red mana. For Villis, it lets you draw a card. And Cephalid Colosseum is a land that deals damage, and Villis will draw cards for that. And if needed, for 1 blue mana we can draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards. You could say, targeting yourself. Syphilitic Colosseum was also played in the cEDH deck, but now it is not played there. That was an attempt to trick Thassa's Oracle's trigger. After demonic consultation has already resolved, we can, in response to Thassa's trigger, crack the Colosseum and target that player, forcing them to draw 3 cards from an empty library and lose the game. Moving on, let's head into the world of monocolor. We're still in the 3rd bracket. And here you see a very specific land. Here, the monocolor is mountains. This is Valakut. Valakut and mountains together are basically a lightning bolt in the form of a land. And considering that I use warp effects and can dump about 20 to 25 cards from my library onto the battlefield at once, I can end up with Valakut and a whole lot of mountains. If, on top of that, we have damage doubling or tripling effects, then that's a huge amount of damage. For example, in the last game, City on Fire, Fiery Emancipation, and Salfim all came out at the same time along with 6 mountains, and the 3 damage that Valakut wanted to deal when those 6 mountains entered was multiplied by 3 twice, and then doubled again thanks to Salfim. That ended up being 54 damage for each mountain that entered the battlefield. So this is a mana base, even though it's monocolored and mostly made up of mountains, that has a little spicy secret which can kill your opponents in a situation I can set up. Besides Valakut, there are also other cards here that you might come across. First of all, there's card draw, but that's a specific feature of my commander, who wants opponents to draw cards outside of their turn, and this way we can force them to do it. Mikakoro and Gaia Reach Sanitarium help us with that. Mutavault, which is a creature of all types and counts as an imp, lets us trigger the commander. Urza Saga, which lets us find Skull Clamp. We make little imps, and we can feed them to it. Here, we can also find Sensei's Divining Top and, of course, Soul Ring. Urza's Cave, which can fetch us either Valakut, Nykthos, or Triome. In monocolor and tribal decks, you might come across lands like these. Nykthos says, based on your devotion to a color, for 2 mana and a tap, you get a lot of mana. Here, we often have a lot of red symbols, as you can see. Triome, based on the number of devils in this deck, can also generate a lot of mana and lets us keep going within a single turn. And now, let's start talking about things like MDFCs. So, in the Modern Horizons 3 set, they released a lot of really cool MDFCs that, if needed, can be played as a land for 3 damage to yourself, either untapped or tapped if you don't need the mana right away, or they can be a spell. And these spells, in some decks, and here, let's move to the top right corner of our deck build. In some decks, you can have quite a few of them. For example, here's the number of MDFCs I use in my Golgari deck with Shelob. Chado Fangulent. I've talked about this deck on my channel, and you can watch a video dedicated to it. As you can see, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 MDFCs, which, if needed, can become tapped or untapped lands, but they're also spells. And then there are lands like Golgari Rot Farm or Giant Lucamus, or others that have a trigger when they enter the battlefield, making you return another land to your hand. This could mean returning a spell to your hand at just the right moment, whichever one you need. For example, we can return Indestructibility. We can bring back Grave Hate. We can bring back a fight. Card draw, another fight, the ability, for your creature to survive, or recursion of a specific card that might draw you a ton of cards or even win you the game. Lands like these let you return those things to your hand, so you'll have 1 more spell to cast. So, in the early stages of the game, this might just be a tap land, but in the late game, thanks to lands like these, it could turn into a spell. In the worst case, if you don't have another land, you can play Golgari Rot Farm, return a battle to your hand, and then next turn play the battle as a tapped land. So, in other words, if you suddenly miss a land drop, you have a land that you just returned to your hand, which you can play again. But this is just one of those options in building your mana base that you should keep in mind. Alright, so we don't have much left. Oh, we still have these two piles left. In this pile, I want to draw your attention to another cycle of lands that I try not to use in decks that rely on tempo. These are lands that care about the number of lands you have, the so-called slow lands. There are also fast lands. In general, I don't really like fast lands in EDH, because most of the time the game doesn't end on turn 2 or 3, which is when they're most effective. But slow lands tend to perform a bit better. But when playing these slow lands in my Davros deck, which I've also talked about on my channel, you can find the video if you go to the main page. And by the way, you can subscribe there if you're interested and have listened this far. I'll keep sharing my experiments on this channel. As you can see, even across several decks, I try not to repeat myself, even when it comes to lands and their types. And in this last little stack here, you'll see that as well. You can check for yourself. So, these are lands that enter untapped if you have more than 2 lands, meaning from turn 3 onward. These lands just come in untapped. I don't try to rush things too much in Davros or push the pace. This isn't Sauron, who wants to kill on turn 4. On turn 4, I just want to start playing slowly and let my opponents play their game too. And overall, these lands perform well. Also, as a specific feature here, you can see Tolaria West, Ominous Cemetery, Demolition Field, and Firelit Thicket. I really like Demolition Field. It lets you deal with a particular land that might be generating a lot of mana. It's a great answer to any scary land, or if you're a real villain, you can destroy someone's reliquary tower and force them to discard their hand. Or the same goes for Nykthos, which can be a huge problem, or Urza's saga on its 2nd chapter, preventing your opponent from finding a specific artifact they were looking for. You can do all of this with Demolition Field. What's nice is that, unlike other effects that just make you lose a land, with Demolition Field, both you and the opponent you're targeting with this unpleasant operation get to search for a land. So you can find yourself another land to replace the one you lost. Well, a basic land, of course, and maybe just stabilize your position. So if you see that you're having trouble stabilizing, like you're missing 1 color out of 3, you can, on turn 3, destroy someone's land that produces 2 mana, or a land that generates a lot of mana, like Cabal Coffers combined with Urborg, or just destroy Urborg itself. If your opponent doesn't have a way to get Urborg back onto the battlefield, then Cabal Coffers will be useless. Honestly, I'd probably specifically target Urborg to destroy. So Demolition Field is an answer to lands, right in the land slot. Highly recommend it. There's also this small cycle of lands that you can sacrifice if needed to draw a card. This works well in decks where you're not always confident about your card draw. You might have plenty of mana already, but you're short on cards, and a land like Fire Islet can really help out. And here's an answer from Doctor Who in the land slot. For 5 mana and tapping, the owner of target creature shuffles that creature into their library. That's a pretty harsh answer. It's not even a kill spell. It's not exile either. It's shuffling it back into the library. And Tolaria West. Tolaria West is a land tutor. So if you want to assemble the Urborg and Cabal Coffers combo, and maybe you already have one of the lands on the battlefield and Tolaria West in your hand. If you have the right colors, you can transmute that land. You can discard it to search your library for a card with mana value 0. Lands specifically have a mana value of 0, so you can search for them with Tolaria West. So, combined with Urza's Cave, which also searches for lands, Tolaria West, and for example, Expedition map. You can find a combo like Urborg and Cabal Coffers without needing green mana, as long as you have black and blue, and generate a huge amount of mana. Now, let's take a look at the final mana base. This is the mana base for the Liberty Prime Commander. I tried to make as few changes as possible to the precon mana base here, really just the bare minimum. I only removed what I consider to be really bad. For example, I don't like lands that require you to reveal another land of a certain type from your hand in order to enter untapped. I don't even want to show them to you because I think those lands are terrible. On the other hand, good lands are the ones that have a Scry 1 trigger. They enter the battlefield tapped, don't have any land types, but they let you clean up your top deck. I use these lands in Liberty Prime to control my top deck. Yeah, I can fetch them. Yeah, they're always going to come in tapped, just like the survival lands. But trust me, in a second bracket table, you have time to play with things like this. First of all. Second, they provide pretty good stabilization. For a 3-color deck, I prefer to have 2 of these, using only my main colors, so I don't want to use all 3. 3 seems like too much. But I'm totally fine with using 2 of these lands, because being able to set up your next turn and knowing what you'll have coming up is really valuable, believe me. And in this deck I interact less with the graveyard, so I don't want to send any of my important stuff to the graveyard. So I'd rather put them on the bottom of my library, so that maybe later I can find them with some of the tutors I have in my deck. Also, here we have Verge and Ash Barrens. Ash Barrens is in almost every precon. It's a really good land that lets you stabilize for just 1 colorless mana. Just discard this card, search your library for a basic land card, and reveal it. So basically, it's like Tolaria West, but in a budget, ultra budget form. Tolaria West does this for a bit more investment, and lets you find a permanent with mana cost 0. But Ash Barrens specifically lets you find a basic land. There are also other cards in the game that, when you discard them, let you find some kind of basic land. If you interact with the graveyard, I recommend having such creatures. They'll support your mana base. Later you can reanimate them. For example, in my Megatron deck, I have an angel that, for 2 mana and by discarding itself, finds me a plains to put into my hand. And I can find any plains. I can get a Triumph, a Shock Land, or just a basic plains. It's the same with Mountain. There's a creature that, when you cycle it, finds you a land to put into your hand, and later you can reanimate that creature. This is going to be very effective. Arbitroin, on the other hand, lets you return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand in a pinch, since it's also an artifact deck, but it interacts less with the graveyard. Still, it's possible. Another Scry land is Eiganjo, since Kamigawa is heavily featured in this deck. I'll talk more about this deck a bit later, or you can check it out on my Moxfield page. I decided that using Kamigawa would be a nice addition. Helios 1 lets you accumulate energy. This is an energy deck, so Helios 1 helps us do exactly that. And next, we have the familiar exotic orchard and command tower. The etheric node gives energy at the exit. We want to generate energy. Oh, Spire of Industry for colored mana. If you have an artifact, or if you're playing with a lot of artifacts, this can be another multicolored land. And now we've reached a unique cycle. These are filter lands. In this deck, I specifically tried to test things like this and see how effective they are. And you know, overall, this thing works. It hasn't let me down. Yeah, on the first turn this land doesn't do anything. You have to pay 1 mana to get a combination of lands. There are talismans in the game, and there are signets. Signets also work as filters. Talismans seem more efficient, but they deal damage to you. So, these lands end up being a bit worse than lands that deal damage to you or produce colorless mana. This cycle right here. They're about equal, but a bit worse because on your first turn you won't be able to play anything for 1 colorless or 1 colored mana. But overall, for slower tables, this is a very suitable cycle. Also, here I tried to use the cycle that checks if you have a plains or island, mountain or plains. And these kinds of lands also perform well. They perform well because I play with a fairly large number of basics here. And most likely, with this amount of basic lands, we'll hit and activate these 3 lands. So if you have a large number of basics, you can safely play these kinds of lands that check for a certain type. Most likely, there's about a 70% chance that you'll hit it, and your dual land will work right away. And overall, these budget lands, the filter lands, also perform well. As for other specifics that can be used here, there's protection, card draw, the ability to tap down all blockers, and also MDFCs. But in this deck, I don't play with bounce lands, although, now that I look at it, I think maybe I should. Yeah, there are already enough MDFCs to start playing bounce lands. Overall, that's everything I wanted to share with you as examples to start with. I hope the information was clear. If anything is unclear to you, like why I use certain things, you can ask me questions in the comments. And in general, let's talk about the manabase. What do you use? What do you think is effective? In my own games, I try to make it so that different decks have different cards, so I can see more cards, see how they work, and evaluate for myself the different power levels of various mana bases and combinations. That's it. Big hugs to you all. See you next time on my channel. Sergey was with you. Bye. By the way, there are still a lot of decks, and I could talk about them for a long time. As many as you want. They're all different. Each one is put together in its own way. Everything's about to fall